and welcome to the latest episode of Occulture, the Occulture show with Lilith Dorsey and Jason Winslade. She's Lilith, I'm Jason. We're doing a show that aired about a year ago and around this time, and it's the fourth season of the HBO show True Detective, and this was called True Detective Night Country. And it's still been in our minds recently because Jodi Foster won both an Emmy and a Golden Globe for Best Actress in a limited series for this role. And it's an amazing show, and there's lots to talk about. I want to start out with saying I love anthology series and the kind of anthology series where it's a different story every season, not individual episodes, but seasons. And I think of American Horror Story and Fargo and True Detective. So, an American Horror Story sometimes actually reuses cast members like it's a theater ensemble, which I think is cool. And of course, the quality of those seasons fluctuates. Fargo is amazing. And True Detective is also amazing. And there's a lot of interesting differences about this last season of True Detective that I hope we see more of, even though there's somewhat controversial among fans. But there are some interesting connections with season one as well. Now, I think I've seen all four of the seasons. You've seen the first and the
I saw the first and the second. I missed the third, or I started the third and it wasn't my favorite. But then I came back in for Jodi Foster and the fourth season. Yeah. Can I just start by saying I love Jodi Foster? While I was waiting to start today, I dug up my autograph of Jodi Foster, which you can't really see, but it says Jodi on it. Yes, I met her on a plane, and it was like, I didn't want to fangirl over her. We went through security at the same time, and they were totally shaking her down. She had the kid's stroller, and they were like, "What's in this stroller?" And I'm standing there going, "Yeah, sure, Jodi Foster's smuggling something in her toddler's stroller. You just want to hassle Jodi Foster or whatnot, And we had all the film equipment. I was down here in New Orleans shooting, and I was going back to New York, so we had all the film equipment, and we were an all-female cast and everything, So I was like, we're standing there. I'm right next to her in first class, waiting to get to my seat. And I was like, I'm just going to say something. And I said, I love your work. I said, I love Bugsy Malone, which I think almost nobody probably says to her. So then she knew I was okay because I love Bugsy Malone. And I asked for an autograph and she wished us good luck on the project.
Wow. So how long ago was that?
It was when I shot my documentary about New Orleans. So it was probably, I want to say 2005, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, Jodi Foster was was kind of omnipresent on my screens when I was a kid in the '70s. All the live action Disney films, and I'm kind of blanking on what they were at this point. But I just remember seeing her in a lot, as the plucky teen, the plucky tomboy, and so yeah, she was very.
Was she in Freaky Friday? I want to say
Freaky Friday, of course. Yeah, that was probably the big one. But yeah, I remember seeing those films in the theater when I was a kid. So she was very much in my consciousness as a star, even at a very young age. Yeah, I've always loved Jodi Foster. And Contact, I mean, come on, that's like one of my favorite movies. The thing about anthology series that I find really interesting is when they have that formula that they then repeat to a certain degree, but then also mess with. And with Fargo, you have various archetypes that are played by different kinds of characters every season. And True Detective is I mean, the core of it, right, it's very noir. It's very because it was started, that classic first season was what is that,
2014. And I kept thinking, there's big giant cojones on HBO that makes us wait 11 years to go from the first season to the fourth season. Right. And we're still watching. So the joke is on us, apparently.
Yeah. And so it was started by this guy, Nick Pizzolatto, who's from New Orleans, actually. He wrote and directed all of that first season, all those three seasons. And season two was a little different because it wasn't quite so focused, and there were more characters, and it was much more of a sprawling drama, and that critically didn't do as well. But the formula for him was to have these two detectives, usually opposites, who um, have to solve a case that involves something that's somewhat dark and creepy, and in some cases has almost an occult element to it. Um, and and then you find out that there's some big conspiracy behind it, and their higher ups don't want them to actually solve it. And so each season has some kind of variation on that. But it was a very and I enjoyed it and everything. And to be honest, I didn't actually watch any of it until last year. So I wasn't there at the inception of the whole thing where everybody was, because it was a big fan, water cooler event type show.
I
But yeah,
remember getting a lot of calls at the time because it was rural Louisiana, right? And there were all these weird, strange figures and everything. So I know I did a couple of podcasts about it. I can't even find them now. I did do a blog post kind of about some sort of real true crime and comparing it to True Detective, so, but, yeah, it has a lot of pluses and minuses, but I am glad that they sort of tied it back around again. It's a cult, it's witchy, it's weird, but it's not really voodoo that first season. I just want to say that from the
right.
beginning because people see something weird and sticks and figures and dolls and stuff and they automatically assume it must be voodoo.
Yeah, and that's what I found interesting in that first season is that they often use that kind of language, but it's almost within the framework of, oh, these are just cops who don't really know any better. They just assume, and so they assume that, and then thus we assume that because it's the story. But the one of the unique things about this most recent season is that it does actually include supernatural elements. Whereas even though the early seasons had all those occult things with all the kind of almost, I think, Lovecraftian references, and uh, the drawing, all that stuff. There wasn't the things that were occult were sort of psychological, and that the Rust Cole's the Matthew McConaughey's character is kind of like he sort of has this pseudo existentialist intellectual take on life that's very dark and occult in a certain way, but there's not actually any other than a serial killer who associates with dark secret rites that are involved killing children and stuff. So there's that kind of occult crime elements, but there's not really anything supernatural. And of course, this last season, there's sort of a debate over what we're seeing is supernatural or not. And we'll get into that in a minute.
I think you could argue that there were supernatural things in that first season. I think there's a way. I don't know how many of our viewers have watched I think it's online on YouTube somewhere, the water magic workshop we did about water magic in film where we were talking about Swamp Thing. So I think cinematically there's a way that they shoot bits of the swamp and bits of that kind of rural Louisiana that plays into the folklore of the place, that sort of
Right.
mise en scène of being just damp and moldy and wet and, weird.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the noir elements of it, it is a cult in that sense, and mise en scène, and the theme and everything. But in terms of the actual story, that's when we get into some other interesting territory. But the other big thing I think about those early seasons, written produced by Dick Pizzolatto, is that, and compared to this most recent season, it's very masculine. It's very like
Rock out with your cock out. Yeah, yeah.
bro heavy vibe, and that they and part of that, again, part of that repeating uh themes and characterizations are that each of these characters are heavily traumatized. Most of them they're either heavily traumatized, or they're deeply flawed only a noir way. Can you have some of this, like Woody Harrelson's character? Like, he seems to be like the more, rational one, but yet he's just messed up in the head in terms of his family and his wife and his mistress and just all this stuff. And there it's very clear that you know they're not good guys in a lot of ways, but they're doing their job. Um, and so that does carry over into Night Country in terms of the female leads. But Night Country is a very different animal in terms of that kind of you know masculine detective genre vibe.
I think it's a very feminine informed mythology. And in a way, I think it's interesting because our last show, if anybody didn't catch it, go back and watch our Twin Peaks tribute to David Lynch. But I think there's that kind of native indigenous mythology that we can see similar things happening with Snoqualmie Falls and that kind of area in betweeny space in Twin Peaks and this in between space we have out on the ice. We've got this pain, and we see this pain in our two main characters. We see it in the two main detectives we're looking at. Jodi Foster's character has lost a child. The other main character has to deal with, spoiler alert, has to deal with her sister, in some sort of weird mental illness moment, ends up dying, whether, by her own hand or by the ghost's hand. So there's this kind of serious loss that they're suffering, and yet they're still protectors. They're still responsible, for the community. They're responsible for the children. They're responsible for all of these things. So there's this kind of, I think, feminine caretaking, nurturing, protecting that they have to have despite the trauma and the tragedy that they've suffered.
When we look at like Alaska as a setting, as a narrative setting, it has that quality of being not only that sense of like distance and otherness, but also that just deep land of mystery, that night country. And the whole thing about polar night being a huge part of that theme, that not seeing the sun for weeks, months. And I gotta say, like I kind of for this wasn't intentional, but I kind of had this draw towards Alaska shows recently. Rewatching Northern Exposure from the 90s, Resident Alien, and then I just finished watching from the summer Sweet Tooth, the final season of Sweet Tooth that aired on Netflix in the summer. But their whole final season is mostly in Alaska, and they're counting down to the polar night. And there's a Nupiaq mythology going on in that show as well. And so there's this just rich treasure trove of stories that come from that kind of environment where people are struggling to survive and finding out who they really are, which could be again construed to be a very sort of masculine thing, but not in this case. And so the showrunner changed for this fourth season, and it was Issa Lopez, who's a Mexican woman, a director, and she very consciously brought on board a very women-centric crew and writing team, and very much changed the vibe. And I find it kind of funny that there was this weird social media thing going on when Pizzolatto decided to like basically crap on it and and say that well, don't blame me for because there were some people who were having trouble with it or whatever because it was changing the formula or whatever, and he did not do himself any favors, and dissed the show that he
It's
created.
horrible.
Yeah. So there's definitely something that taking something that's up until now been very very masculine, and feminizing it in a way that's even the word feminizing, it makes it sound like it makes it like less or weak, but no, to me this is like the strongest that I've seen. And what I find really fascinating about the story is that there is still this broader conspiracy, but there's also a kind of a, for lack of a better term, a counter conspiracy by the women. So we're gonna get into spoiler territory pretty strongly here. So it's a year old show. If you haven't seen it, you should see
Go
it
watch
first.
it.
There's only like, what, 6 episodes, 8 episodes. I forget how many. It's a very short season, but it's we binged it in like 2 nights. Um, and but yeah, there's a whole thing going on that's about women taking care of themselves, and in a way that is you know I don't want to say it's scary, but it is kind of scary about how efficient they can be, because they're painted as being kind of invisible. In fact, indeed is the case, that a lot of the women who you find out that they took revenge on these scientists who basically ganged up together and to murder this woman who was a protester. And you realize by the end of the show, you've been seeing these women in the background all over the place. They've always been there, and then you don't realize until the end that they are a community. I mean, you see that they're a community, but you don't realize where they directed you know their anger and revenge.
Well, I mean, I think that's the whole point of, decolonizing and male centering your brain, right? Like we see them. I was thinking about what is it, the first or the second episode where the woman gets hurt in the factory, and the grandma woman is just like, yeah, I hit him with this thing. So what? It's like they're sticking together, they're protecting each other against the men, against these evils. And I think it's also ironic to set it in Alaska, because when we look at this, my brother-in-law lived in Alaska. Alaska is not known for its female population. Their women are in the huge minority when we look at, all of the Arctic Circle. So despite all of that, these are the women in power. These are the women that have respect. And I think probably one of the things that upset people was just that they did have this power despite the challenges. Because when we look at the first season, they have these challenges and they fall apart. They're messy. They're sloppy. They hurt people around them over and over again. And in this, we see them genuinely trying to help. It doesn't always work, because that's life. But I think it's a much more realistic. Well, I mean, the other's realistic, but it's unpleasant. This is realistic and empowering in a way. And that's what I loved about it.
Yeah, and in those early seasons, the female roles really were in that noir tradition. They really were throwaway characters that were there to forward the men's stories, especially season two. Even though that one of the detectives was a woman in that, for the most part, it really was about these women who are supporting their men and really didn't have their own stories. So that's a big shift here. But I think we should back up a bit and sort of like, so that the premise there is that these scientists have disappeared, and from this lab, and in the Arctic, and it's this fictional town of Ennis, is very small town, and they're found frozen together in the ice, like some kind of crazy, like frozen Bosch painting,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
and what I found funny, I was looking up I was researching some of this, and seeing that Issa Lopez's, when she was putting this together, a lot of her inspiration was The Thing and The Shining, um, and Alien, right? Because it really is
Yeah.
about that kind of like, in that very enclosed environment, and where you don't know where the enemy is coming from. Um, and so, yeah, you have Jodie Foster's character, and I'm gonna do right and use these character names. Um,
Good for you.
she's so yeah, she Chief Liz Danvers, and she's also played as kind of racist. She's got this adopted Inupiaq daughter who she doesn't want to learn her language or be part of her culture. She's got a chip on her shoulders. Not, of course, her child died, but which, you don't really find out until further into the show. But she's really a hard ass, and in a way that alienates everyone around her, and not just because she's an uppity female. She's really kind of an asshole. Um, and so that's what I find interesting about, like, the how she got she got all that attention award season, playing this role.
See, I
Um,
didn't read her as an asshole at all. I didn't read her as that. I read her as just being overprotective of the daughter and not wanting her to get lost because she's already lost the son, right? Like I don't know. I invented a backstory that it was like triggering for her because this was that part of their heritage and she couldn't
right.
connect to it, and that was something that took them further away from her, and she was trying to keep her so close, right? Like that's how I read it.
Well, her motivations are certainly understandable. Her motivations are strong, but the way that she acts upon them is assholish. and
Yeah. I mean, I
and
think that was a conscious choice, though, from the
oh yeah,
showrunner, because we've
sure, that's
got,
the character.
the cop with his little son, Darwin, or whatever, who's like, oh, did you leave him with grandma? And she's telling him the old stories. And, like there's definitely this racial tension between and even the cop is sort of unsure of her heritage and stuff like that. And stands almost outside of it, right? Everything in this is liminal. We're all in this in between space over and over again.
Right. So that Anupia cop is, Trooper Navarro, Evangeline Navarro, who has a very kind of, Evangeline is a very sort of Christian name, and part of the whole story arc for her character arc is that she doesn't know her Anupiac name, and she has to kind of go through this pretty much shamanic initiation to get that name. And I found that actress fascinating. Callie Reis. I'm not sure how you say it. Reis. She was a professional boxer,
Mm-hmm.
and she's from Rhode Island, but is from the Wampanoag tribe. So she's indigenous, playing this character, and uh, she was just so fascinating to watch because she just had so many layers going on as a character and as an actress. And so they're put together, to solve this, and also harkens back to this case of the activist who was killed. And so they go through all these various things, to find out the connection between the cases. And I also want to add one of my favorite character actors, British character actors, Fiona Shaw. Would watch her read the phone book. She was Mrs. Dursley in Harry Potter. That's probably how she's best known, but she's been in a ton of things. And she was just an Andor, that the best Star Wars show, um, a couple years ago. But so this is where we first begin to see the sort of supernatural elements to this. And she basically sees her dead husband out in the snow trying to talk to her by these big gestures, and it's kind of presented in this matter of fact way that the ghost of her dead husband is out there. And now I didn't know this when I was watching the show. I just, doing my research, I found out that dead ghost is the father of Rust Cole's, Matthew McConaughey's character. And I guess, there, at one point, one of his interviews in season one, he's talking about how his father took them to Alaska, that he had, because he had leukemia, and so he basically decides to go out in the snow rather than suffer. And that's how there's this sort of suicide by exposure theme it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
in this show. And so, based on the fact that Fiona Shaw's character is seeing this ghost and she's friends with Navarro, they have these conversations about, how do you know the difference between mental illness and the supernatural? And they're really fascinating conversations because there's clearly no definitive answer there. And she says sometimes it is and sometimes it's not. You know?
I love the way she's getting stoned, rolling a joint during that scene.
Right.
It's great.
Yeah, because there's and I think that's the thing for the show is that I think later on they talk about how, well, when you're going through hypothermia you hallucinate, and that could explain some things, um, but you're not sure if what if there's actually, because again, unlike those earlier seasons, we're seeing full on, we're seeing dead people, we're seeing hallucinations, we're seeing various kinds of, and the guys who, the lab technicians who were killed clearly were terrified out of their minds. So there, and there's even that sense, and again, I've heard different ideas about this, because towards the end of the show, Navarro goes out into the ice without a hat and gloves on, and there's this implication that she's committing suicide. But then you see her later on at Jodi Foster's lake house, but they don't touch and they don't talk. So
Mm-hmm.
there's the controversy over, is she alive or is she dead? Um, and some people have, because there's even like some people are saying, oh well, the evidence is, well, in the show they talk about other people having sightings of her, so she must be alive. But maybe they're all seeing the ghost. Who knows?
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
don't know really, ultimately what happens to her.
All I can think of is there are strange things done in the midnight sun. It's that the rules are different here, right? That was my favorite poem when I was a kid because I did not want to freeze to death. But there are just different rules here, right? Like it was like I was saying about Twin Peaks. We're in this in between space. We don't know what happens out on the ice. We do know, like every good folk tale, that we don't want to be stuck there alone. We know that. So who knows? It's certainly something we've seen over and over again, but I think it's rare that we see it from this feminine perspective. And I didn't realize she had a mostly female crew as well. And I think, that makes a difference.
We need more of that. We
Yeah,
really need.
definitely.
Um, there's so much potential with stories like this. So I'm kind of hoping that, I mean, there is going to be another True Detective season. I'm not sure if Pizzolatto is coming back to it or not, but I hope not. Kind of.
Yeah, right. I hope not too.
I mean, there's something to be said in our culture about noir as a very masculinist genre, and it has its place, and I love good noir, these very very male oriented stories that are, because like most media is male oriented stories that try to hide that, whereas you know these noir examples, and True Detective especially, they wear that masculinity on their sleeve. Like, it's very clear it's a man's world. um and I think there's something to be said about that, but we need the balance. Right.
And you've got all these women as sort of non-player characters in that first season, and it's just like, what? They're so generic. There's like, wife, girlfriend, prostitute, like
Right.
what? Like, it's also revolutionary in the fact that by highlighting this murdered woman, we're also bringing attention to missing and murdered Indigenous women, which I think that and I've seen them do this as well in other crime dramas and stuff like that. But I think it's a real problem. And more people are going to watch this than some documentary about missing and murdered Indigenous women. So I think it's a good way to sort of, open the door a little bit to some of the things that are really going on.
Right. That's a very important point. I mean, and going back to what you said earlier about the connections, the big quote from season one that Matthew McConaughey's character says, "Time is a flat circle," so that that all this stuff is connected. And one of the things that, again, going back to the whole notion of a detective, I was thinking of when you look at the journey of Russ Cole's character in season one, and then Navarro's character in Night Country, that they are in a lot of ways going through this shamanic initiation and becoming shamanic detectives. And I was looking this up, and that's actually a genre of Native American fiction, the shamanic detective, which is funny
This is
because
why I was talking about Twin Peaks. This is another shamanic detective.
right, it is a genre. And again, I was just, there's an episode of Northern Exposure where Ed, who's training to be a shaman also winds up, being trained to be a detective. So there's private dick,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, so that's a whole genre of crime stories is solving the mysteries from that kind of indigenous perspective. And again, we need more of that, and I'm looking forward to seeing what some people will be doing with those kinds of ideas. um, yeah, I mean, again, from the occult perspective, we love that crossover into the supernatural. We love the connection to cultural roots and cultural rituals and things like that. But we also love it when the stories offer opportunities for new insights that audiences don't usually have a chance to get, because of who's behind the camera or who's on the screen, and how the story is being written. So thumbs up for
Yeah, I'm all the thumbs up. All my thumbs are up here. And I just want to thank everybody for watching. We've had a lot of success with our past couple of episodes. I think our David Lynch tribute was the best episode we've had in a long, long time. So I really appreciate that. And everybody liking and commenting. We can get stars now if anybody's still on, FB or IG. The people can send us stars, and we still have a Patreon. Can you tell them what the Patreon is?
And Patreon is patreon.com/Papa Culture Show, and join us on there for extra goodies. And we're coming up on Valentine's Day, and if you would like to revisit past shows, we have our episode about the Love Witch. You can find where we had the Glam Witch, Michael Herkus, as our guest, talking about that classic movie.
I love the Glam Witch. It's
that is of
amazing.
that is the Love Witches of the season. So if you want to revisit that from last year, please do. And otherwise, we'll see you the next time on the Pop Culture Show. I'm Jason Winslade, and
I'm Lilith Dorsey.